Good everyone. It's an immense pleasure to welcome you all for the IGNA Endorsed Webmaster Series 2020. It would be running till December 23rd. Today we are into the webinar 8. Today we have three eminent speakers for the day. And I should really admit today is a very, very special day and will be very close to my heart forever. Because like I have got the opportunity to introduce my teacher, Dr. Georgie Abraham. Dr. Georgie Abraham is a professor at Pondicherry Institute of Medical Sciences and IIT Madras. He is a consultant nephrologist at Madras Medical Mission Hospital, Chennai. Got n number of awards and recognition, and a few notable achievements is he is a recipient of International Distributed Medal in Nephrology by the American Kidney Foundation. He is the first recipient of International Society for Peritoneal Dialysis, the Diametris and the Orophilis Award for his lifetime contribution to peritoneal dialysis. He has received Rosie Robinson Award in 2015 for his excellence in education of nephrology and medicine at Cape Town, and he has received Baxter Memorial Award by the Canadian Society of Nephrology, and he has received the Excellent Award for CKU funds, and he has received the Eminent Teacher Award by IMA and PACE Championship Award in 2017, and he has got a lot of publications, national and international. He has got more than 300 abstracts of more than 263. He has contributed to several chapters and textbooks. Like, I'm very happy in introducing Dr. Georgie Abraham. And over to you, sir.
Good evening, Dr. Kalaivani, Professor Susan, and Professor Arpana Iyengar. It's a matter of great pride for me to chair your session. And I'm sure that, the delegates would enjoy your presentation. And I would like first to introduce Dr. Arpana Iyengar. She is, I was privileged to nominate her for the fellowship of the Royal College of Physicians of London, and she succeeded in that. She is currently the professor, Department of Pediatric Nephrology, St. John's National Academy of Health Sciences, Bangalore, India. She also is the deputy chair, ISN Clinical Research Program, core committee member of ISN Education, executive committee member of ISN South Asia, of the Royal College of Physicians of London, which was awarded to her in 2019. She has to go and receive the award. Core committee member, ISNWH Initiative for End-Stage Kidney Disease, and nephrology specialist member, ABPM Jana Arogya Yojana, National Health Authority of India. So both the speakers, Professor Susan and Professor Arpana, are internationally renowned pediatric nephrologists, and they have contributed enormously to the growth of pediatric nephrology in our country. And I'm privileged and humbled to be the chairperson for the presentation. So, Arpana, are you going to start first? Arpana?
Sure, sir. Yes,
okay.
Sir.
So Arpana is going to speak about nutrition. I'm just going to show you a slide of the nutrition. And I have great interest in nutrition. So Arpana hopefully will dwell on extent of malnutrition in CKD and CKD-D in India, and how to assess malnutrition, growth and augmenting therapy, anemia management, calcium, phosphorus, total protein, albumin, mineral disease, diet in vegetarian and non-vegetarian, and diet in CAPD, APD, hemodialysis and transplant, and how to assess the nutrition in children. And I request Arpana to start a talk so that we can listen to her. Arpana, the floor is for you. Hello, Arpana.
Yes, sir. I'm just projecting my slides. 1 minute.
Yes.
Good evening, dear colleagues, respected chairperson. Thank you very much, Dr. Georgie, sir, for providing us with a prelude to our session. Sir has been a godfather to me, and I'm really honored to have him chair this session in particular, as it is he who has brought out this book on management of malnutrition in CKD in South Asia. My sincere thanks also to Professor Namalwar sir, Dr. Kalaivani and her entire team for inviting us to be a part of this unique online education series. Today, I plan to look at nutrition, what is actually different in the assessment and management of nutrition in children with CKD. We in this part of the world are quite accustomed to seeing children malnourished, even without CKD. And this sometimes unknowingly becomes a problem as nutrition care takes a backseat in our day-to-day practice. I plan to cover this topic in 3 parts. 1, share certain concepts. 2, introduce certain assessment tools. And 3, brush through management principles. As soon as you hear the term nutrition, I'm sure all of you would recall the dreadful time we used to have taking dietary history as pediatric trainees. Nutrition is most often taken synonymous with a diet chart. And diet chart is most commonly, it gives an impression of food restriction. We are quite familiar with such prescription, aren't we? A long list of medications, some of them have to be taken with food, some of them have to be taken 2 hours before food, some of them have to be taken after food, and so on. How often do we actually look at the food which comes in between these medications? And how many of us actually think of adding nutrients to the child's prescription? I'm here to display some pictures that I'm sure many of you would be quite familiar in your day-to-day practice. This is a 7-year-old girl who weighs just 12 kg. She's on a chronic peritoneal dialysis prescription for more than 5 years. This boy came to us in this state, having gone from doctor to doctor at 14 years of age because of a posturethral valve and weighed just 15 kgs. He couldn't move and he succumbed. This 18-month-old kid just weighs 6 kgs, and you can see how the catheter is excluded because there is no subcutaneous fat at all. And in contrast, you can see this boy who is 30 kgs at 4 years of age, but nevertheless, he is not healthy. So what is actually malnutrition? The WHO definition stands as 2 entities for malnutrition. One is undernutrition, which includes stunting, which is less height for age, wasting, which is less weight for height, underweight, which is less weight for age, and deficiency of micronutrients. It also extends to overweight and obesity. And therefore, both these, undernutrition and overweight obesity, forms the spectrum of malnutrition. Let me step back and share a message that this paper in the Lancet, which came out early this year, conveyed. It was in the context of striving to attain the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. This is a global initiative wherein we're not looking at only health, but looking at other aspects of life: education, irrigation, sanitation, safety, housing, etc. And in this context, to achieve these goals, they have proposed that the child's health has to take center stage. And in this paper, they describe how children were interviewed and they were asked, what makes them feel happy and healthy? And you will be overwhelmed to hear their response. Children said they wanted to be cared by parents and family. They wanted the opportunity to play. They did not want the fear of hunger in them. They wanted to be secure, have a warm, clean house, attend school, and engage in cultural activities. These were so-called normal, healthy children. Do you think our children with CKD would answer in a different way? Not really. And one way to touch their hearts and to make them feel better is to focus on their nutrition. So there is evidence to say that short stature and poor appetite in children is associated with low quality of life. And this is not only evident in the West, that the paper which you see here in 2019 addressed, it also was observed in our study, which was also reported in 2019, that nutrition status has a bearing on quality of life of the child. Is it only quality of life or something more than that? Malnutrition is an independent predictor of mortality in CKD. Be it height, weight, BMI, serum albumin, they all have an impact on mortality. The risk rises when the height standard deviation score decreases by 1. When the weight decreases by 5% over a period of 3 months, you have higher mortality. With every decrease of 1 standard deviation of BMI, there is a 6% risk of death. Serum albumin associated with mortality and also increased hospital admissions. So having said this, how does one define or identify malnutrition in CKD? Well, there are many parameters that people have proposed. It depends on which parameter you take. So if you talk about growth failure, then we are talking about stunting, where we are looking at height for age. And this is the proportion, 37% to 55%. If you're talking of undernutrition, which could be probably parameter used could be a BMI or a mid-arm circumference or weight for age, then the proportion is 20 to 60%. And the last entity is something called wasting. And today I would be introducing this new terminology that is relevant to CKD, and that is called protein energy wasting. And this has got its own criteria. We'll come to that in a bit. But if you look at the Western literature on protein energy wasting in children, the proportion is 7 to 20% are affected with PEW. In contrast, a study done in our center, which was just published this year in the Journal of Renal Nutrition, we observed that 58% of our children with CKD had protein energy wasting. So protein energy wasting clearly is not same as protein energy malnutrition. PEM is something all of us pediatricians are very, very familiar with. So what's the difference? In PEM, you're only looking at nutritional intake and nutritional factors for to maintain the nutrition status. But in wasting, you have non-nutritional factors that govern the cause for wasting in a condition like chronic kidney disease. So to put it simply, in PEM, you have reduced fat, but in wasting, you have relatively preserved fat. You have preserved muscle in PEM, but you can have muscle loss over time in wasting. You have usually decreased metabolic rate in malnutrition, but in PEW, you can have increased metabolic rate. The appetite is really good. We know how our children who are malnourished without CKD have a good appetite. And in PEW, the appetite is usually low. There is a good response to nutrition supplementation in malnutrition, but it may not be the case in PEW. So this is the main difference in the concept, how a protein energy malnutrition is different and how PEW, which is very relevant to CKD, differs from PEM. So as I said, besides decreased protein and calorie intake, there are a lot of other factors that in CKD that govern this wasting concept. It could be acidosis, it could be the uremic milieu, it could be inflammation, dialysis, and all this could lead to a hormonal imbalance leading on to anorexia. It could lead to insulin resistance, protein degradation, and one can see that there is decreased protein synthesis or increased protein breakdown in the muscle, leading on to muscle mass loss, muscle wasting, or in extreme conditions, it's called sarcopenia. So in 2008, the adult criteria for protein energy wasting was proposed. And in 2014, adapted from the adult criteria, the pediatric criteria was proposed, and it's got 5 points. The first entity is the biochemical parameters, which incorporates cholesterol, albumin, transferrin, and CRP. So kindly note, CRP is trying to bring in the concept of additional inflammation in protein energy wasting. Reduced body mass, which is measured through a BMI for height age. And when I say height age, it is the age at which the height is at the 50th centile. Reduced muscle mass, which is again measured by mid-arm circumference for height age. Dietary intake, that is assessed through appetite. And the fifth point, which is very important in children, is poor growth. Again, the parameter of short stature is used here for this fifth point, which is very unique to pediatric criteria for PW. And then the PW, once diagnosed, can be again stratified based on the severity as mild, which has 2 criteria or more, standard PW, which has 3 criteria out of these 5 criteria, and modified, which is the severe most category, wherein you have more than 3 categories that you will fulfill, and it definitely has to include the point of short stature. If one would look at comparing the CKD comorbidities as a whole between the West and what we would see in practice, our study, which came out in 2017, had these proportions of comorbidities in CKD 2 to 4. And I just tried to compare that with the largest cohort of the CKD in children, that is a CKD study. And you see, strikingly, you can see that short stature is 50% in our study compared to only 12% in the West. And in contrast, you see 1% of obesity and 15% of obesity in the CKD study. Similarly, if you look at PW, between the CKD study and our study, of course, these are the numbers, ours is a smaller number, the burden is higher. And if you see that the stratification, you will see that we have a higher number of children in the modified criteria, which means to say short stature is really a big problem in our children. So what if a child has PW? What are the consequences? So there is enough evidence, especially in adults, that bring out the association between PW and mortality, PW and hospitalizations, PW and cardiovascular events, and quality of life. So this is the first part of my talk, wherein I wanted to share the newer concept of protein energy wasting as opposed to just malnutrition. Moving on to the second part of my talk, which is introducing certain assessment tools. How do we assess wasting or malnutrition in these children? And the KDOQI has come out with the adult guidelines for nutrition just this year, and I will be highlighting some of the points in a bit. But we as pediatricians are still waiting for the newer guidelines. But for today, it's only apt to go back to the KDOQI guidelines of 2009, where the recommendations go as follows, that children should have a dietary intake, assessment, height for age, height velocity, estimation of dry weight for age, BMI for height age, head circumference in children less than 3 years, and a normalized protein catabolic rate in adolescents on hemodialysis. You will all agree with me if I share with you these points, which are actually challenges in the nutritional assessment. Children are growing. We are looking after children who are from birth to 18 years, and there are various changes in the body composition. So interpretation of nutritional status becomes challenging. Children could have edema, and that comes in the way of accurate measurement of mid-arm circumference or weight or BMI calculations. The etiology of CKD, glomerular diseases progress faster, and you don't see much of growth retardation in them. In contrast to tubular disorders that show up earlier in life and progress slowly, leaving the child stunted and malnourished. Medications that affect growth, like corticosteroids, could also contribute to the nutritional status of the child. And comorbidities like bent bones, bony deformities, it's very difficult to even measure height in these kids, leave alone subjecting them to a DEXA scan or a BIA bioimpedance analysis. And the bottom line is there is no single tool yet which is ideal for measurement or assessment of malnutrition, either in children or in adults. I would project the body here in terms of getting the concept of body composition through various compartments. Yes, our body has various compartments, and altogether these compartments contribute to the body weight. How then are anthropometric measures like mid-arm circumference and body mass index reflecting these compartments in the body? Let's just look at that. So the body weight broadly can be contributed by two main compartments, that is the fat-free mass and the fat mass. And fat-free mass again consists of the cellular tissue mass and the bone. And the third component is the total body water, which could be extracellular or intracellular. So the fat-free mass simplistically can be divided into just two components, that is the extracellular mass and the body cell mass. So the body cell mass comprises of the cellular tissue and the intracellular water. And this is the metabolically active part of the body. So if you have good body cell mass, then you are considered healthy. But what are our anthropometric measures doing? They are just looking at a combination of fat-free mass and fat mass. Even the BMI looks at a combination of fat and fat-free mass. They're not able to split the fat and the fat-free mass compartments. And what does skin fold thickness do? It relates to the fat mass. But none of these anthropometric measures are going anywhere near looking at what is the total body water or what is the body cell mass, which are more relevant in children with CKD. So we have limitations in the anthropometry and the biochemistry assessment tools. The dietary intake could be underreported and therefore underestimated. You take the serum albumin in fluid overload, it can be underestimated. The height could be overestimated because you can have non-nutritional causes for short stature along with nutritional causes. The weight can be overestimated because of edema, and so does the mid-arm circumference and the skill fold thickness. So we were interested to know what is the body fat composition in our kids with CKD. Are these children who look skinny and malnourished having body fat in the normal range, or are they deficient in body fat? So we took 33 children. This has been published in the Indian Journal of Nephrology this year. 33 children CKD 2 to 5D, and 60% of them had low mid-arm circumference. 24 had a low BMI. But you see the low body fat percentage was only 12 to 18, depending on whether we used a BIA, that is a bioimpedance analysis, or a DEXA. And there was no difference in the proportion of the children who were having low body fat between the ones who were on dialysis and pre-dialysis. So the bottom line was, yes, our children with CKD and ESRD have preserved fat in their bodies. So then why are they looking skinny? Obviously, when the mid-arm circumference is 60%, low mid-arm circumference is a proportion, and fat is preserved, that means definitely the muscle is the target organ that is involved. And muscle wasting probably is something that these children have. So we went ahead and looked at, is protein energy wasting common in our children with CKD? We took 123 children, CKD 2 to 4 and ESRD. And we found, using those 5 criteria that I had pointed out earlier, 58% had PEW. This PEW was not associated with age, gender, or etiology, but was associated with the duration of CKD and severity of CKD, which is not surprising. Looking at the pre-dialysis children and the proportion of PW, 47% had PW. And if you look at the criteria of reduced appetite, low mid-arm circumference, low BMI, there was definitely a significant difference between the ones who had PW and those who did not have PW. Moving on to the biochemical criteria, including inflammation, there was no difference between those who had PW and those who did not have PW. In other words, it was the anthropometric measures that helped us differentiate those with and without PW in children between CKD 2 to 4. Let's see what happens in children with ESRD on dialysis. 73% had PW, not surprising, compared to 47%. They are ESRD kids. And if one looked at the appetite and the anthropometric parameters, again, there was a significant difference in the proportions with and without PW. However, similar to the pre-dialysis children, the biochemical measures did not help us in differentiating those with and without PW. So if you see these, the proportions are not significant. So again, even in children on dialysis, it is the anthropometric measures and appetite that help us to differentiate those who have and who do not have wasting. We then moved on to the next comprehensive tool that is called Subjective Global Nutritional Assessment. This not only takes care of the anthropometric measures, but also includes diet, gastrointestinal symptoms, functional capacity, loss of muscle and subcutaneous fat by physical examination of the child, and presence of edema. And the unique part of this tool is that it need not be done by a doctor. We have trained our nurses to undertake this assessment. And it is subjective, of course. So you have a score in the end. And depending on the score, you categorize children as no malnutrition, mild malnutrition, and severe malnutrition. We did a study to validate this SGNA with mid-arm circumference. We took mid-arm circumference as the gold standard here. Actually, there's no gold standard yet in assessment tools of nutrition in CKD, but we took mid-arm circumference because that tool was not incorporated into the SGNA. The SGNA just had the height and weight and height velocity. So we had to have an independent parameter of assessment parameter, and we took mid-arm circumference. So in these 100 children, you can see in the ones who were not on dialysis, SGNA had a high specificity and reasonably good sensitivity. In contrast, in children with stage 5 and on dialysis, the specificity and sensitivity was not good. So SGNA could be used as a sensitive diagnostic tool in children who are not on dialysis. I would just like to quickly highlight the various studies on pediatric nutrition that the CKID cohort undertook. There was an observation of higher intake of calories, protein, sodium, and phosphorus, more than the recommended intake in these children. When the GFR was less than 30, it was associated with greater risk of poor appetite. In adolescents, lower GFR and obesity was associated with greater screen time and lesser physical activity time. And lower hand grip, strength, and frailty are newer concepts that are being studied in the CKID cohort. Coming back to our body composition. So if the anthropometric measures are not really great surrogate parameters to assess nutrition, do we have anything beyond anthropometric measures? Well, you must have heard of bioimpedance analysis. Now, what is this? This works on a principle wherein a low intensity current passes through your body. So your body is the conductor. And this current, when it passes through your body, the resistance to this current is measured. And what it measures is actually the total body water. And you can always derive the fat-free mass and the fat compartment through the total body water. And we have formulae for that. So BIA is one option, and it's important because the total body water compartment could get definitely altered in children with CKD. The other tool is the DEXA. The KDOQI Guidelines for Nutrition 2020, which has come out for the adults, clearly mentions that DEXA is a standard tool to measure body composition. And probably at present, we only have DEXA that is closest as a standard tool for clinical practice. As I told you earlier, we are interested in the body cell mass because I told you that this compartment is actually the metabolically active compartment. So if I am having good body cell mass, then my tissue activity is going to be the maximum, and that defines health. So this is what the KDOQI 2020 says, that the BIA is suggested as a tool for ongoing follow-up in HD patients, not efficient in PD patients, and DEXA is the tool suggested for body composition. Here is a study that we did, published last year, where we looked at how do we target dry weight in our children who are on dialysis. Because if I don't have the dry weight, then I'm going to overestimate the weight and say, okay, he's gaining weight. That gain in weight could be because of fluid retention. So this is called a bioimpedance vector analysis. And you see the circles there, they are all representing normal healthy controls. You see the small arrow, it is pointing at a red dot, which means that pre-dialysis, the child had fluid within the body. And after weeks of dialysis, not just one session, 3 sessions in a week and following 3 to 4 weeks, you see the longer arrow points at the dot which has gone into that circle, which means now that that is the dry weight. The child's weight at that session of dialysis, wherein the dot has gone inside, that means that much of fluid ultrafiltration has been taken out over time. And probably that's the time we need to measure the nutritional status. NPCR is normalized protein catabolic rate, and this is the objective measure of the daily protein intake in hemodialysis patients applicable to adolescents, and an NPCR less than 1 gram per kg per day can predict weight loss. There are other parameters like the urea reduction rate, the total nitrogen appearance, protein equivalent of nitrogen appearance. All these are again parameters in dialysis patients for nutrition, and you'll hear some more about these in the next talk by Dr. Susan. Interesting slide. Did you know that we all emit gamma rays? Well, I was surprised when I was asked this question a few years back. Yes, we do, from naturally occurring radioactive potassium-40. And this potassium-40 is inside our cells, because you know that potassium, 98% of potassium is intracellular. And the radioactive potassium K40 is inside these cells. It emits gamma rays. And if I can measure that potassium, which is inside the cells, am I not going to be close to measuring the body cell mass, which I told you is a metabolically active tissue? So this is the research that we are undertaking at present, and I hope that in a couple of years, we will have some more answers. This is the whole body potassium counter, and studying the intracellular potassium, the total body potassium, which can be translated to body cell mass, and find out whether these kids who look malnourished have actually normal, less body cell mass. Coming to the last part of my presentation, this is on the principles of management. I will not be able to go to all the details, but suffice to say that this year we were fortunate to have guidelines from the European Society of Pediatric Nephrology and the Pediatric Renal Nutrition Task Force on energy and protein requirements in children with CKD ESRD, including dietary management of calcium and phosphate in these children. So when it comes to nutritional therapy, the suggested dietary intake is what is recommended, which means it is a range of values, which is energy, kilocalories per kg per day, based on the age of the child, and again protein gram per kg per day based on the age of the child. So if the child is on dialysis, especially peritoneal dialysis, then we could use a higher value in the range, because we need to provide a higher amount of proteins due to the expected loss through peritoneal dialysis. So this has come out in 2020 guidelines. The guidelines also focus on infant feeding, which is encouraging breastfeeding in infants, whey-dominant infant feed, fortifying infant formula feed, which is not actually practical in our setting. They talk about glucose polymers and fat emulsions, but I'll give you an example of how we tackled giving an infant formula through enteral feeds in a bit. And gradual increase in supplementation, encourage solid feed, encourage oral feeds. If need be, then start enteral feeds through NG tube or something called the gastrostomy, which is very unique to pediatric intervention for nutrition. We also have to focus on the lipids, on calcium and phosphate balance, add bicarbonate to tackle metabolic acidosis. And in children, again, it's unique that we need to sometimes look at electrolyte supplementation. Unlike in adults, we have to give phosphate supplementation, magnesium supplementation, potassium supplementations because of our tubular disorders in children, micronutrients, vitamins, trace elements, fiber. 14 grams per kg per day of fiber is recommended in the guidelines, and that also needs to be part of our dietary advice. And salt, which is again dietary allowance for approaches for stopping hypertension with low salt diet is something that is recommended. So this is an example of an 18-year-old girl in ESRD on chronic peritoneal dialysis, weighing just 6 kgs. So if we calculated her energy, it was 447 kilocalories per day with a protein of 7.8, and we could give her 600 ml of fluid per day. So if we have to start enteral feeds, we used F75 and F100. As pediatricians, we are all aware of F75 and F100. We used to use them for malnourished children, and we use the same thing for this child. This is the composition of F75 and F100, and by giving 50 ml of F75 every 2 hours, we could give her 450 kilocalories and 5.4 grams of protein. Similarly, if total parenteral nutrition was something that we had to go in for, if enteral feeds did not work, then the injectable emulsion that is available with us is Cabiven, which has amino acids, electrolytes, dextrose, and lipid. And this is the composition. And similarly, a 640 ml of Cabiven would give 450 kilocalories of energy and 15 grams protein. So these are just examples to show we don't encounter these challenges every other day, but one child who just doesn't tolerate oral or enteral feeds, we got to calculate and look up how to provide total parenteral nutrition. For children on dialysis, this is more, I think, more familiar to you all, that you have various supplements. It's important to see what they contain: calories, proteins, and definitely no phosphate and low potassium. So in that sense, Reno Pro fares the best. So there is evidence to say that enteral feeds increases the BMI in children less than 2 years on peritoneal dialysis compared to oral feeds alone. And in terms of intradialytic parenteral nutrition that I was talking about, you do it only when there is persistent weight loss despite all your efforts to provide oral or enteral feeds, persistent hypoalbuminemia, and a low NPCR. And there has been evidence to show that there was improvement in the NPCR and serum albumin in hemodialysis children. Of course, besides nutrition supplementation, as I always try to highlight during this talk, that we are also looking at non-nutritional factors, and that is why nutrition is different in CKD. That we have to provide dialysis. We just can't give nutrition supplements and not dialyze the children who are in CKD stage 5. But there is no evidence actually to say that increased dialysis frequency or adequacy or use of high flux dialysis have benefit on the nutritional markers. What about comorbidities? Important to address the hyperparathyroidism, hyperphosphatemia, metabolic acidosis. There is some evidence to show that there was an increase in the mid-arm circumference and serum albumin when the bicarbonates were around 24 millifilms per liter. And of course, CKD MBD in terms of vitamin D deficiency should also be addressed. Again, growth hormone becomes an important intervention in children, and we've had guidelines coming up just last year, wherein the indication to use growth hormone is clear. CKD 3 to 5 or 5D, more than 6 months of age, where there is persistent growth failure, and we have addressed all the other reversible or treatable risk factors. The child should have growth potential. We cannot use this in a child whose epiphysis has closed. And how does this act? How does this help? It decreases the CRP. It increases the lean body mass. So this is the way growth hormone can influence the nutritional status. Exercise is a very unique intervention. We don't talk about exercise in malnourished children without CKD, but in CKD, especially in adults, it has been seen that there is increased muscle oxidative capacity, there is increased insulin-like growth factor 1, and these aerobic and resistant exercises have had an influence on nutritional markers, mainly in adults. The anti-inflammatory agents, again, have a place in treating protein energy wasting in CKD. Pentoxifylline, etanercept, which is a TNF-alpha agonist, myostatin inhibitors, antioxidants. Something that the adult nephrology patients are prescribed is this appetite stimulant called megestrol acetate. We have not yet used in children, but in adults, this has improved appetite. And there is a study in children where the BMI has increased when they are on peritoneal dialysis, and it also decreases the inflammation. anti-serotonin agent called cyproheptadine also can be used as an appetite stimulant. Anabolic steroids, testosterone has been used, but this is another drug, androlone deconate. There are RCTs, again in adults, which have shown that there is an increase in lean body mass, BMI, and serum albumin. So to conclude, as I said, I wanted to highlight 3 aspects under nutrition in CKD in children. One is to share the concept that we are not dealing with the malnutrition that we pediatricians are so familiar with. We are dealing with something beyond malnutrition. We could call it protein energy wasting or muscle atrophy, muscle loss, and so on. So this is different because it is not governed by only nutritional factors, it is also governed by non-nutritional factors. The assessment tools, as I enumerated, a lot of tools are available, but many of them are still not ready to be for use in clinical practice. What we have found is that the anthropometry are still useful than the biochemical parameters, especially to define the protein wasting entity. And though we have non-nutritional factors, in children, we always look at nutrition first. Only after that, we would even think of exploring other novel strategies to combat this comorbidity in children. I would like to end the talk by sharing this picture. This picture is worth several words. We all perceive this attitude of resilience in our kids, in our ailing kids, I should say. Despite being deprived of their favorite things, including their favorite food, they adapt quickly, they show great responsibility, and they spring back with a smile. Something that we adults continue to learn from them each and every day. So my sincere gratitude to all our kids and my faculty, nurses, and dietitian residents who take care of these kids along with my colleagues in the department. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Arpana, for the lucid and wonderful talk. And you covered most of the problems facing Indian CKD, non-dialysis and dialysis patients. So, Dr. Kalevani, are we taking questions now or at the end of Dr. Professor?
No, towards the end, sir. We are taking questions towards the end.
Okay. So let me move on to the next renowned speaker, Professor Susan Uthup. She is the professor and head department of pediatric nephrology, SAT Hospital, Government Medical College, Thiruvananthapuram, honorary consultant pediatric nephrologist, Sri Chitra Institute of Science and Technology, member board of studies, subspecialty Kerala University Health Sciences, faculty in Institute of Management of Government of Kerala. She has many publications in national and international journals and member of the draft committee of ISBN guidelines, coordinator of the ISN SRC program, SAT with CCHMC USA. She was the first rank in Mahatma Gandhi University for second and final MBBS and best outgoing student from Kottayam Medical College in 1991, winner of Ambadi Bhaskara Gold Medal 1991, and H.L. Trivedi, late Professor H.L. Trivedi Gold Medal in DNB Nephrology 2004 at national level, and fellow of the ISN and Pediatric Nephrology Fellowship she has done at Cincinnati Children's Hospital in Ohio, USA in 2012. Dr. Susan will address or dwell on hemodialysis in children. And the questions are: when to initiate hemodialysis, access, should it be arteriovenous fistula, AV graft, or a PEM cath, prescription and adequacy, nutrition and growth has been already covered by excellent talk by Professor Arpana Iyengar, anemia management, hypertension control, schooling. Why I said that in hospital for sick children and in other places, developed countries, either the teacher comes to the dialysis unit and takes class for them and sits with them during the dialysis program, and how do we help schooling in our country, psychosocial aspects, and when should we take a child for transplant. Dr. Susan, the floor is for you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Georgie, for that excellent overview and what I have to do today. And I would like to thank Professor Namalwar sir and Dr. Kalaivani for giving me this opportunity to become a part of this international webinar series that is going on now. And I will be talking on how to manage hemodialysis in a child with kidney failure. What are the parameters that we have to assess for checking the adequacy, and what are things I should be monitoring? So in the next 35 minutes or so, I will be talking on the concept of renal replacement, how to prescribe and how to optimize dialysis, how to measure the adequacy and adequacy beyond urea kinetics, and monitoring the optimum dialysis, and finally, how to say that dialysis is actually a bridge to transplantation in these kids. Actually, kidney is the housekeeper for our body, maintaining the internal homeostasis. And we know that the glomerular filtration, whatever is happening, and the efficient tubular secretion, and the filtration and secretion and reabsorption that is happening throughout the body, throughout maintaining the internal homeostasis. But what will happen if the kidney is failing? Once the kidney fails, then the internal homeostasis is going to be affected. So we have to replace the renal function. The kidney is actually doing for us that the kidney is maintaining the internal homeostasis for us, and the internal homeostasis means it is the maintenance of the acid-base balance, electrolyte balance, the fluid balance, and so on and so forth. And not only this, apart from the excretory function, the endocrine functions are also important in maintaining the bone health, maintaining the this hemoglobin status, so that we are all pink and we are all healthy and every day very active in our life. And the blood pressure maintenance is also a part of the kidney function. And if the kidney is failing, then we have to replace. And how we are going to replace? We need to purify the blood and maintain homeostasis. And then the answer is, let us do dialysis. The dialysis can be either peritoneal dialysis or hemodialysis. But remember that dialysis only is a bridge to transplantation, and it is an artificial process by which the solute composition of a solution is altered by exposing it to a second solution through a semi-permeable membrane. And the way in which the purification is occurring is the solute removal is by diffusion and convection, and the fluid removal is by ultrafiltration. So we aim to provide an optimum or adequate dialysis. And for this, we have to have an optimum dialysis prescription. And not only prescription is sufficient, we have to assess the adequacy of delivered dialysis so that the child will be having a good quality of life and a good survival. But remember that dialysis only partially replaces the kidney function. As shown here, the survival on dialysis, once it is assessed, we can see that it is not the end of the story, because the mortality on dialysis is very high. 30 to 150 times the mortality is higher than the general pediatric population. And these children, why do they die? They die because of, not because we are not replacing the kidney functions and we are not trying to maintain the internal homeostasis, but because we are actually concentrating on some of the uremic solutes only, and we are not exactly correcting the body fluid balance. And this will be actually reflected onto the cardiovascular mortality, which is the leading cause of mortality in kids with ESRD. These children are 1,000 times more prone to die of CVD compared to the general population. Looking at the story of a 9-year-old boy who was brought to emergency room with breathlessness in the early morning hours. He is a case of end-stage kidney disease and was initiated on maintenance hemodialysis by a right internal tubular perm cap 6 months back. He had resistant FSGS, and at the initiation of dialysis, his weight was 27.4 with a height of 132 centimeters. But look at his BMI, it is only 14.3. So this child who is presenting with severe fluid overload and pulmonary edema, is this child getting adequate dialysis? So the next question will be, can we measure dialysis? And even if we measure dialysis, how will we optimize the dialysis in these kids? So what constitutes an adequate dialysis? We know that we can measure the native kidney function, though it is far from ideal. We measure urea and creatinine as the uremic solutes, and we can even quantify the clearance of individual solutes. But measuring dialysis, we are looking at the ability of small solute clearance most often, that is the KT/V of urea. And based on this number, we decide on the frequency and duration of therapy to achieve the number. Looking very simple, but this concept has not stopped evolving since its introduction in 1980s. And we can also see that over the years, the adequacy concept is evolving. From the time in 1940s when this called for cough rotating drum dialysis machine came, and then subsequently the coil dialyzer, and people were getting dialyzed and their life was getting actually sustained for some time. The National Cooperative Dialysis Study in 1981, actually the era of adequacy started then. The minimal dose of dialysis and the concept of adequacy and the urea clearance concept was proposed by Gorge. And then we can see that over the years what is happening. The relevant studies have changed our concept on the adequacy. And the dialysis sessions were long initially, but financial constraints and the logistics have actually, the pressure was created on shortening the dialysis, and this hemo study was coming in 2000 and telling that even if we keep a higher this single pole KT/V, actually it is not improving the survival. So where we have to draw the bottom line? What is an adequate dialysis? Is KT/V urea, which is the index of urea clearance that is used as the principal tool to estimate dialysis dose, is it sufficient? The urea reduction ratio and the NPCR, the urea kinetic modeling to assess whether whatever we prescribe is adequately delivered. All these concepts are now evolving, and you can see that over the years, lot of adequacy guidelines have emerged. Lot of guidelines are coming, and the nephrologist and the people who are taking care of kids on dialysis are getting confused. So the measures of adequacy is actually concentrating on solute clearance, and that also small solute clearance. And urea is the marker for the small solute clearance because it is the small molecule that is cleared very fast. And the KT/V concept, every one of us is knowing, and it is actually the K is the dialyzer clearance, and the time on dialysis is T, and the volume of distribution of urea is V. And the Dogger's equation is helping us to calculate this. And right now we have got dialysis machines which will be giving you the online KT/V, which is so easy for us to know. But the volume of distribution of urea and the volume of distribution of other small molecules like guanidine is different, and which is also uremic toxin. And then the concept of middle molecule clearance, the convective clearance, all is there around us. And the hemodiafiltration, which is actually concentrating on the middle molecule clearance by convective clearance. So a concept of convective clearance dose is also coming. And whether the convective clearance of middle molecules is going to optimize the growth of these children, improve the nutrition in these children, all these are evolving, and we are actually in an era where we really don't know whether KT/V urea is going to stand the test of time further. It has stood the test of time over so many years, 40 years, but over the next few years, over the next 20 years, we don't know whether we are going to have other adequacy parameters. And you can also see that the KT/V, when you have this nomogram, you can see that even the post and pre-BUN, when you compare, and the K of the dialyzer and the ultrafiltration percentage that is going to be there, actually the KT by V is different when the ultrafiltration is changing. And there is more ultrafiltration, the KT by V become better. So it is taking into consideration the ultrafiltration also, and that is the advantage compared to urea reduction ratio. So as I have told you, is solute clearance or urea clearance only important? What about the fluid balance? The fluid balance is another important aspect of dialysis that we have to consider. So, but let us first talk about the solute clearance. The KT by V and its modifications are still remaining a useful measure of hemodialysis dose, and the KT by V calculators are there, but the limitations are there because it does not represent other middle molecules or protein-bound solutes or even phosphate. Phosphate, we know that it is a small molecule, but the phosphate clearance is not very good with the regular conventional hemodialysis that we do, because the phosphate is surrounded by water molecules which actually decrease its clearance. And another thing is KT by V, we are considering the clearance in a single session. And it cannot compare the treatment when the dialysis frequency is more than 3 times weekly. We have got KT by V coming up. And then overestimation of dialysis delivered is there in a small or malnourished. Smallness is our norm because pediatrics, we know we are dealing with small patients. We'll be having a smaller V. And so that will be overestimating the KT over V. And KT over V is not considering the contribution of residual renal clearance. And so the most important points that we have to look at is the errors in the timing of post-dialysis urea termination. So there is the single pool and double pool equilibrated KT by V concepts, where we will be actually collecting the urea in the post sample of urea is collected 30 minutes after the dialysis, so that we will be taking care of the access and cardiopulmonary recirculation, and also giving time for the equilibration of urea from extravascular to the vascular compartment. And that you can see that the change in the post-dialysis urea that is happening when we actually collect it later, that is after the access recirculation is dissipated in 20 seconds, whereas after 2 minutes the cardiopulmonary recirculation, and after half an hour the equilibration of urea is happening. And so the post-dialysis urea rebounds, and this rebounding is taken care of in the equilibrated or double pool KT by V. And this equilibrated KT by V is actually lesser than the single pool KT by V. So this KT by V concept is there, and how will we decide on the dose of dialysis? The time, the amount of urea that is cleared by the hollow fiber, that is K, and the volume that is to be cleared, that is the child's total body water. All we know, and then we know the K, we know the V, and based on that we can actually decide on the duration of dialysis which we have to give to achieve the this single pool KT by V of 1.4 or a urea reduction ratio that is more than 70%. And so we have to choose a dialyzer with appropriate K and calculate the time based on the target dialysis dose. And then, so we have given a prescription and we have given a dialysis, but whether the prescribed dialysis is delivered, how will we assess that? And this can be calculated by the bedside formula or the online clearance that is given by the machine, the KT by V now we get from the machine itself. What are the alternatives to KT by V? We can look at the urea reduction ratio by looking at the post-dialysis and pre-dialysis BUN or urea, and this limitation is it is not considering the ultrafiltration, and there can be a broad range of KT by V for a given urea reduction ratio because KT by V takes into consideration the ultrafiltration also. The optimal urea reduction should be 70%, that is what we target, and at least it should be more than, it should be at least 65%. Then comes the normalized protein catabolic rate, which is an indirect measure of daily protein intake by the stable patient, and it is a useful adjunct in assessing the dialysis adequacy, and NPCR should be measured at least monthly, and the goal is kept at 1 to 1.4 gram per kg. An adequate KT by V and NPCR is ensuring that we are having an adequate nutrition and dialysis clearance. The formula for NPCR calculation takes into consideration the urea generation rate, G, the volume, that is the estimated total body water, and the time in minutes, from the end of the dialysis to the beginning of next dialysis. So we know that we are achieving the KT by V and the URR, but the patient survival is actually still remaining suboptimal. So what is the reason? So that is we have to look at the next entity, that is the fluid control, which is also a major determinant of optimum dialysis. Dry weight is the ideal goal. And so what is the dry weight? It is the lowest post-dialysis weight a child can tolerate without development of symptoms of hypotension. So when we are having an intermittent fluid removal as in hemodialysis, the tolerance of extra fluid removal becomes an issue because refilling has to come from the other compartments. Hypotension is most often when the high ultrafiltration rate is there. In adult, more than 13 ml per kg per hour is not to be given, whereas in a child, even more than 10 ml per kg per hour is not to be entertained. Because even if a larger interdialytic weight gain is there, you have to know that a rapid fluid removal during dialysis will produce cardiac muscle stunning, and there is increased cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. To understand this, we have to look at the time-old guidance curve, where you have got the body volume increased, that is edematous patient, the normal is remaining here, and if the blood volume is very much reduced, the patient will die. And so when we are doing a dialysis, less than 5% change in the body blood volume, if the percentage change is less than 5, then the edema will remain and more is to be removed. And progressive decline over the dialysis time, that is maximum 8% is removed in the first hour and then 4% per hour for the next 2 hours. The total 16% is removed. There is time for positive refill, and so it is a slow, sustained removal, and the patient is not developing hypotension. Whereas if we do a rapid or excessive ultrafiltration, too rapid a UF, the patient can develop a cardiac arrest while we are having the child on dialysis. So estimating the optimum weight in children, that is, it is by careful assessment by each dialysis, the persistent fluid removal till the patient's BP become normal after dialysis is completed. At the end of each dialysis session, child should be at his or her target or optimum weight. Antihypertensive medications are usually unnecessary at this optimum weight, and child who is always hypotensive, I have seen that children who are on dialysis, if you are finding it difficult to control the blood pressure, even using multiple drugs, then he is definitely above his target weight. And daily dialysis sessions to remove the fluid in an adequate manner and achieving the dry weight, we will be able to reduce the number of drugs and sometimes even get off the medications. We have to periodically assess and upgrade the target weight or dry weight in these children because children are growing. And frequency of this monitoring depends on the age of the child. The infant will need assessment every week because the infant is growing at a faster rate. 200 gram per week is the weight gain that is added if they are having good nutrition and optimally dialyzed. Whereas a school-age child, you need to assess only once a month. So the fluid balance assessment can be clinical assessment. Sometimes the subclinical silent fluid overload may be there. Slowly the child is requiring more and more antihypertensive medications. But when you look at the child is clinically not overloaded. Then comes the symptomatic fluid overload where the child is coming with edema, breathlessness, hypertension and all. Uncontrolled blood pressure, intermittent episodes of pulmonary edema and problems like that. And symptomatic hypovolemia, if you are actually dialyzing below the dry weight, the child will be complaining of cramps, a washed or drained feeling after the dialysis, and the hypotensive episodes that are coming during the dialysis, where you have to give more fluid to the child during dialysis. The advances which have come and technology is advancing, and that is helping us to assess the fluid balance in a better manner. Dr. Arpana has already said about the bioimpedance spectroscopy that is coming up, and that is already there to assess the body fluid status in a better manner. And we can have this pro-BNP checked lung ultrasound and IVC collapsibility index that can be assessed in each and every unit now itself. And the CRIT lines that are there to relative blood volume monitoring during the dialysis That is again a good concept in assessing the change in the blood volume during dialysis. A probe in the arterial line will measure change in hematocrit during dialysis and will calculate the change in the blood volume using a software program. You can see that this patient on dialysis is having a crit monitoring and a graph like this. You can see that after the dialysis is stopped, the ultrafiltration is stopped. We can see that there is a going up of the line because he has not achieved his dry weight and there is refilling from other compartments. Whereas patient B, you can see that there is no going up of this line because he is already at the dry weight. The dry weight is achieved. So this is actually a very good method by which we can monitor during dialysis. A steep decline in relative blood volume suggests that we are rapidly removing the fluid and so we have to reduce the UF rate. A flat line will be indicating that the ultrafiltration is low and the ultrafiltration rate can be further increased. Then the residual kidney function, very important. Every 1 ml per minute of residual renal function is adding to the Kt by V by 0.13. How will you find out the residual kidney function? This is possible by measuring the urine samples in the interdialytic period and calculating the urea clearance by the UV by P formula. And if the child is having residual kidney function and a good urine output and some amount of urea clearance is there, then we are actually having a better volume control, better phosphate and potassium clearance. The requirement for erythropoietin will be less and there will be better quality of life and better survival. How will we preserve the residual renal function? We all know that when the child or an adult is started on hemodialysis, the residual renal function drop is faster in hemodialysis compared to peritoneal dialysis because of the fluid shifts that are happening intermittently during hemodialysis. We have to, how we can preserve the residual renal function? That is possible by not over-dialyzing. So we have to ensure hydration, optimize the blood pressure control, avoiding hypotensive episodes and avoiding nephrotoxic medications, use of biocompatible dialyzers and maintaining the water quality in the unit. So monitoring the water quality is also important. So it is the adequacy of dialysis and what we are doing is actually influenced by so many factors, and maintenance of water quality and checking the water quality is one of those. So what is the optimum amount according to the KDOQI guidelines? At least 4 hours per session for minimum 3 sessions a week. That is 12 hours we have to dialyze. If we can actually have a frequency increased and the duration reduced so that 12 hours per week is achieved, but whether such frequent daily dialysis, whether that is doing a good job compared to this 4 hours a session for 3 weeks. And so that is at least 4 hours. Sometimes if the patient is having no residual renal function also, the thrice weekly dialysis with a minimum dialysis time of 3 hours per treatment is advocated. And if the child is having large interdialytic weight gain, very high blood pressure that is uncontrolled, metabolic complications are there, longer sessions or extra session, you can dialyze them daily and achieve the dry weight. That will be more optimum than removing lot of fluid in one session. The child has to reduce the sodium intake, and adequate sodium and water removal will help in managing the hypertension and also maintaining the volume. Longer sessions and slower UF better tolerated. Shorter sessions and rapid UF will produce muscle cramps and hypotension. And so interdialytic hypotension is to be avoided. And then optimum amount of dialysis to be prescribed according to the guideline is we have to have a minimally adequate Kt by V. The target Kt by V is actually higher than the minimally adequate. And monitor the Kt over V and NPCR monthly. Remember that adequacy is not a number, but it is a concept. Assessment of adequacy is recommended every 1 to 2 months, where we will be actually comparing the prescribed amount of dialysis with the delivered amount of dialysis and seeing whether the adequacy is achieved. This is a teamwork, and we have to have an adequacy or quality assessment team in the dialysis unit with monthly adequacy meetings where each child's clinical parameter is assessed, the lab parameter is assessed, the audit for reasons for under dialysis, and the corrective steps are as needed is enforced. The concept of incremental dialysis, I have already said, patients who are not actually adequately dialyzed, you can give them incremental dialysis. So we have moved a long way from the rotating drum and the coil dialyzers. Our dialysis units are now, the technological revolution has helped us to achieve very good dialysis with precise volumetric ultrafiltration control, continuous blood volume monitoring, buffered bicarbonate solutions as dialysate, synthetic biocompatible membranes, high flux dialyzers, ultra pure dialysate, and the various convective modalities, hemodiafiltration, online hemodiafiltration, for optimizing the growth of children. All this is there at our doorstep now. So what are the steps in adequacy assessment? We have to review the KT over V and urea reduction ratios, the NPCR and the resting energy expenditures to be assessed, ultrafiltration requirement per session is to be monitored, dry weight is to be reached and then subsequently assessed and modified according to the growth of the child. Hemodynamic stability should be maintained during dialysis sessions. Review the intradialytic and interdialytic symptoms and blood pressure control. Pre-dialysis should be maintained between 50th and 90th percentile. Remember that access is the Achilles heel. And without a good access, there is no good dialysis. So assessment of access is also important. Total kidney replacement requires more than just dialysis, but a minimum amount of dialysis is still required to optimize both duration as well as quality of life. A life with quality, that is our aim. And remember that maintaining kids on dialysis indefinitely is like passing a death sentence for that child. Don't keep children on long-term dialysis. Transplant them at the earliest so that their body mechanisms, body composition, everything is in a better state as you transplant them early. Also remember that cardiovascular disease, that is left ventricular hypertrophy, hypertensive cardiomyopathy, dilated cardiomyopathy, then this vascular disease, because of the calcium phosphate metabolism abnormalities, vascular calcification that is going to be there. All this is contributing to the high mortality due to CVD. And the MBD status, they have to grow and they have to have good bones. Their growth and nutritional status maintenance is important. The activity and well-being is important. As I have already told you, a quality survival as a bridge to transplant is important in maintaining the kids on dialysis. So what are the labs that we have to do for assessing the adequacy? Monthly optimum pre-dialysis biochemical parameters. You can see that hemoglobin kept between 11 and 12, bicarb between 20 and 26, potassium 3.5 to 5.5. Phosphate is actually age-related, and for an adolescent, it is less than 5.5, whereas a smaller child, you will be allowing a little higher phosphate because the growth is happening and the bone is also getting modeled. And serum albumin more than 4 gram and a normal lipid profile. This is what we want, and adequacy of these labs should be assessed every month. And this is a sample hemodialysis report card, which is to be given to each child whom you are dialyzing, where you have to keep a goal, and then we have to, every month, you have to enter the values and see whether you are able to maintain the good hemodialysis and adequate hemodialysis. So rectification of suboptimal dialysis, how is it possible? If you are delivering a KT by V, which is less than prescribed, the most important point that I have seen to be important is the access-related problems. Maintaining an access is difficult in kids. Very small kids, AV fistula, even though the policy is fistula first, creating an AV fistula with small vessels is going to be difficult. And also the flow-related problems are more in an access. And also then we are using the perm cath, which is there more commonly used. Access in bigger children, perm cath in smaller children. The access recirculation is high. So the access related problems, then the sperm cath, there can be a thrombus, there can be infection related issues. So maintaining access is a problem. Access related problems and low blood flow and access recirculation may be the factor which is actually resulting in a low delivered Kt over V than the prescribed. Then you have to assess the dialyzer, whether you are using the optimum dialyzer with a proper dial, the efficiency and the flux of the dialyzer that we are using is optimum. Then low dialysate flow, then premature termination of dialysis due to hypotensive episodes or other problems that are happening. Then, so we have to improve the clearance K by increasing the blood flow, increasing the dialysate flow, choosing a high efficiency dialyzer, and optimal functioning of the dialyzer is to be, what is the fiber bundle volume? When we are having a dialyzer reuse, we have to periodically assess the fiber bundle volume and decide whether this dialyzer will be optimally functioning. We can increase the time on dialysis, increase the frequency of sessions, and use convective modalities to improve clearance. As I have already told you, fistula is very important. We have to maintain a functioning fistula, and a long-lasting vascular access is actually the most important factor for a successful hemodialysis. And the access, when we are puncturing and putting the needle, the technique has to be optimum so that the access is not damaged and infection is minimized. Then the target free dialysis urea and NPCR nutrition, we have already heard a lot from Dr. Arpana, so I am not going to talk about nutrition in this presentation. So from the child's point of view is also important. What is the concept of good dialysis if you ask the child? Child will be telling lasting for a short while, no pain, no needles, no pricks, and no feeling of unwell during dialysis. Hypotension is going to, cramps are going to make him actually fear coming to the dialysis room. Then good appetite, good sleep, able to maintain, able to have maximum time at home, no restriction on food and fluids, go out and play with friends, be regular at school. And so the teachers coming and teaching him in the units that I have seen in the West, but it is not practiced in our India, because maybe we are having a lot of children and the schools are overcrowded and population is so large. So allowing the child to go to the school regularly. How will we do that? All that we have to modify the way in which we deliver our dialysis. So there is a concept of effective survival time. That is when you take the life and from which you have to negate the time that is taken for taking a treatment, whether it is dialysis or whether it is any other form of treatment, and the time taken for reaching there and the time spent. So the quality time, the effective survival time is important for a child who is on dialysis. The adequacy is beyond urea kinetic measurements. The optimal removal of middle molecules, optimal ultrafiltration, control of hypertension without drugs, anemia, if possible, the EPO doses, which can be actually, when we are giving a good nutrition, good dialysis, we will be able to see that the child's requirement of erythropoietin is coming down. Optimizing MBD, mineral bone disease, the PTH levels, the hyperparathyroidism is going to result in more anemia. Cardiovascular assessment should be done periodically. And the child should be, if child is going into the pubertal age group, optimizing the growth and pubertal status is also important. Symptomatic improvement on dialysis does not equate to adequacy. Remember that the dialysis dose that reduces uremic symptoms is lower than the dose shown to increase survival. Because correction of anemia with erythropoietin actually will correct most of the symptoms attributed to uremia. And the urea, when you look at urea, it is actually dependent on other factors also, protein intake, protein catabolic rate, residual renal function and all. So a low urea may not indicate that your dialysis is good, but the child is malnourished. So there is a multi-dimensional measure of dialysis adequacy. That is the current concept, moving beyond small solute kinetics and small solute clearance, and maximize the quality of life and survival. And we have to have a comprehensive construct for the dialysis dose, optimizing not only the solute, but not only optimizing the fluid, but optimizing the nutrition, optimizing the growth, optimizing the physical activity. So we are actually giving a comprehensive dialysis dose and comprehensive ESRD treatment where patient will be actually feeling well. So ideal clinical perspective of an optimally dialyzed child will be good biochemical control, good hematology, body composition becomes optimum fluid status, child is normotensive, well nourished and growing well, physically active, he is having good tolerance to dialysis, good psychosocial adjustment, good access longevity without complications, preservation of residual kidney function, and overall good quality of life. Providing psychosocial and educational support is also important from the treating team, promoting good school attendance. And this is by a multidisciplinary team who will be managing not only dialysis, but providing a comprehensive psychosocial support for the child. And child-friendly dialysis units, unique pediatric dialysis centers should come up. Child should not be dialyzed along with in an adult unit along with the adults. Timely initiation of dialysis is important. Don't delay the initiation. Delaying initiation actually will result in more malnutrition, more morbidity, and the child who is going to be unhealthy to start with. So timely initiation is important. And what is the time? Previously, we were telling that less than 15 ml per minute of GFR you have to start. But now the concept is changing. Only when the child is having reduced appetite, not gaining weight, child's blood pressure is not getting controlled, and child is not feeling overall well. That is the time we have to initiate. That in a congenital and a Charcot, we will be initiating when the GFR is near 5 ml per minute. Whereas in a child who is having glomerular disease, we may be starting at 15 when the child is edematous and hypertensive. And the modality of choice should be tailored to the child, whether we have to decide on PD or HD. And in the correct dialyzer, pediatric tubings and catheters is important. And we have to periodically assess the adequacy and modify our prescription. And all this treatment should be an integrated treatment with a transplant plans, which should be done as the child is metabolically stabilized and the child is nutritionally adequate. All the biochemical parameters are reasonably controlled. And at that point of time, we have to go for the transplant. Remember, the dialysis is just a bridge to transplantation in children. And when we are talking about child's dialysis, parental burnout also to be considered. We have to support the parents. They are losing their wages. The finances is an issue. So CKD management and ESRD management and dialysis management is actually a comprehensive care where we will be concentrating not only on dialysis but also on other social issues so that the child is helped to reach that point when the child is getting a successful transplant and a good life ahead. Remember that dialysis is not akin to total renal replacement. Optimum rather than adequate dialysis should be the rule. Adequacy is just a concept, not just a number. And urea kinetic measurement alone will suffice. Fluid balance is crucial for optimizing the outcome. Adequacy assessment is done every 1 to 2 months, and comprehensive child-friendly hemodialysis units should deliver adequate dialysis based on optimum prescription tailored to the child's needs. I would like to thank my team and all these children who are actually teaching us daily how to refine ourselves in our treatment so that they are helped to reach the point when they get a good transplant and a good life. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Susan, for this wonderful presentation. You address most of the issues which are facing children, and I am sure that there will be questions. But let me start. Professor Nammalvar, I'm sorry that I couldn't acknowledge you, so forgive me for that. So let me move forward to Arpana. Professor Arpana, I would just start rolling the ball. See, the objective of nutrition is to slow the progression of chronic kidney disease, to prevent malnutrition, which is one of the major issues in our country, and to prevent uremic symptoms. So you were talking about malnutrition, and from your data and publications, malnutrition is widely prevalent in India. And I would just like to ask you, when you talked about the protein energy wasting, and you what should be the high biological value protein? Because when we look at in adults, high biological value protein intake is very low, even though patients are eating protein. So what are the high biological value protein you would provide to your children or with malnutrition?
Yes, sir. This is a very relevant issue when it comes to protein supplementation in children, or even assessing the normal protein intake in children. Unlike in adults, we do not restrict protein in children because we have to strike the right balance for optimal growth. So children should receive the normal proteins for the age and the stage of CKD, additional proteins when they're on dialysis. But as Sir just mentioned, it's also important to see that the protein taken is of high biological value. So the common protein of high biological value that we advise kids is egg in those who eat egg, and soya flour or soya, any preparation of soya for the ones who don't eat egg. So I didn't mention this, but we have studied the dietary intake of protein and calorie in our kids, and I was surprised to see that the protein intake was not really bad. The calorie intake was not far away from what was recommended, despite that we have children who are malnourished. So probably that is telling us that the high biological value of proteins needs to be looked at, and bioavailability of these proteins is also a critical issue in protein supplementation.
I just want to bring one more concept. When we talk about protein intake, protein phosphorus ratio, because children, usually growing children, have high phosphorus. So this protein phosphorus ratio, how far should a nutritionist, while taking care of a child, should look at that, and how do they balance it?
Yes, sir. So again, this is again critical in children. We struggle to strike the right balance between protein and phosphorus. The guideline recommendations from the ESPN has a nice simple table that gives us the proportion of protein is to phosphate in various foods that we can refer to. And one way of, again, egg is a good supplement that keeps the right balance between protein and phosphate. So we encourage the white of egg to be taken by children. And of course, if one avoids all the phosphate-rich foods, which is usually in stored, tinned, canned foodstuff or bakery items, we still can manage keeping phosphate intake minimum, and see that the protein supplementation does not get compromised.
And the next one is, when you come to the infants and small children, they may not like the food you are giving them. What is the role of enteral feeding in these patients, or jejunostomy or gastrostomy tube in feeding these children? Even though I don't know that whether you are practicing it or whether any pediatric nephrologist in the country is practicing it.
Yes, sir. As you rightly said, some kids are really fussy, especially infants or less than 3 years of age, and they don't abide by oral supplementation recommendations or prescriptions. Then we try enteral, and they don't like the nasogastric tube too. So in certain situations where there is persistent weight loss or no weight gain over time, despite prescribing the optimal nutrition supplements, we offer them gastrostomy. We have done gastrostomy only in 2 children out of the several children we have been taking care of in the last 20 years. So it's not something that we commonly do, basically because of the in the West, it's a norm that if the child is not growing well, then they immediately move on to gastrostomy. Here, acceptance from parents itself is an issue, and probably even the comfort zone from their nephrologist to initiate gastrostomy and sustain nutritional care through gastrostomy is also a challenge.
One last question, Dr. Arpana. Let's say that we have a child with FSCS and severe nephrotic syndrome with a 24-hour urine protein of about 6 to 8 grams per day. So what should be the recommendation of giving protein? Because this question is often asked by pediatricians and also by colleagues. So what should be the protein intake for this particular child with severe nephrotic syndrome?
So nephrotic syndrome going on to CKD or ESRD is a big challenge. There is a lot of edema, and even assessing malnutrition accurately is a challenge. Besides that, the protein loss is happening through the urine. Of course, the protein loss will start decreasing as the GFR decreases, and one would look at the serum albumin. So in early stages of CKD, the serum albumin could be low, but once the child gets into ESRD, the serum albumin due to the protein loss through urine will come down. But if the child has still got a serum albumin of less than 3.8, which is part of protein energy wasting, or say less than 2.5, which we usually use in nephrotic syndrome, then the protein has to be additional protein has to be supplemented, and that can go by the suggested dietary daily intake range from lower to higher, which I mentioned. So one could use the higher value to supplement proteins.
Thank you, Arpana. Thank you for this wonderful talk as well as this interactive session. Let me move on to Professor Susan now. Professor Susan, thank you for that. You ultimately put everything, including the access. See, the basic thing I just wanted, in our unit in adults, we have a BCM, and every month we monitor the BCM of our patients, and especially those who are come with a lot of weight gain. And this helps us in tailoring the fluid removal, So I know that the fluid removal you have already highlighted that it should not exceed 13 ml per kilogram per hour for adults and 10 ml per kilogram for children. So you think that I saw your beautiful children standing in front of SIT hospital. I have started coming there from 1960 for my uncle's daughter's birth. So from 1950, 65 onwards, I am seeing it. So I'm just wondering, your children who are standing there, and how will you monitor them with regard to their salt intake? This is a major issue in children on hemodialysis. They like chips, potato chips. Now they have the masala dosa in front of them and so many things. So do you think that you have a BCM and it should be done regularly in children who are on dialysis, hemodialysis, to monitor their lean body mass as well as to see that, what is happening with the fat mass?
Sir, can you repeat the
what I
question
said
once again, because I didn't get it.
Yeah, we do BCM in all our adult patients because we have a BCM on a monthly basis, and we tailor the dialysis and the dry weight according to the BCM. There are a few patients who come with excessive weight gain, so we tell them to be very strict by using the BCM. Children, it is very difficult to restrict the salt intake, and they come, they eat chips and they eat banana or whatever, with salty food and pickle and all those puppet. So do you think that you should have a BCM monitored regularly on your children so that you can know or you can decide on the lean body mass and the fat mass and so and so with your therapy of hemodialysis?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In that, what we have seen is the dietary monitoring and dietary restrictions are a real problem when we are managing the children with ESRD. And what we have seen is we are actually not able to do the monitoring regularly. And what we do is we actually see their dry weight, as of their dry weight, by looking at what point of time they are having a blood pressure control that is achieved. And what I have seen is if you dialyze them regularly and more frequent dialysis is given in a hypertensive child, you are able to achieve that weight when the blood pressure medications are adequately used or even get off the medications. And another thing is if the child is having a good urine output is there, especially a child with tubulointerstitial diseases, they are having a better volume control and better blood pressure control compared to children who are having a glomerular disease. And so salt restriction is strictly enforced by us, but we really don't know how much they are actually following our instruction regarding the salt intake. And some of them will be coming with very severe hypertension requiring antihypertensives in the number like 4 or 5 antihypertensives to be given to some of these children. We all know that this coming off the antihypertensive medications is sometimes really difficult, and a really good adequate dialysis is going to help in achieving a better blood pressure control. So we are right now moving more clinically rather than the blood volume monitoring and all. We are not doing that now.
So you insisted that children should get 4 hours of dialysis 3 times a week. Practically, with regard to economics and lot of things, it is difficult, or this practice is not feasible in our country. So, because we see a lot of our patients who are on twice weekly dialysis. Even this Kam Kalandar was suggesting that if you have good urine output, you don't have to go on 3 times a week dialysis, because the important parameters are, one is the weight gain, next one is the echo, and then look at their weight and their blood pressure control. So do you think that, as you said, that all children should be on 4 hours, 3 times a week dialysis, or can we tailor it down to twice a week dialysis in a subset of patients?
Definitely, depending on the residual renal function. If the urine output is good and the residual renal function is adequate, then definitely you can go for a twice weekly dialysis, and then as the child is moving along with the child, you will realize that slowly the residual renal function will start going down. At that point of time, you can actually increase the dialysis dose by increasing the frequency. You can start with twice weekly, that is fine. All depends on, so each dialysis prescription should be tailored to the child's needs and the child's residual renal function, volume status, blood pressure control, and the nutrition, and all these things have to be taken into consideration. We cannot pass the blanket prescription to all kids. I totally agree with you, sir.
Yeah, one more thing. I would just like to, I may be naive in making this statement. We should not take more than 10% of the blood volume for dialysis through the extracorporeal circuit, because in very young children, you need to have the small dialyzer and the tubings. Is it possible to have this achieved or accomplished most of the time? The blood volume in the circuit, extracorporeal circuit.
See, in Trivandrum, actually in Trivandrum, we are not getting small tubings, pediatric tubings we are not getting it in Trivandrum. We are still using the adult tubings, and we find that children who are very small, like children who are less than 10 kg, sometimes we have to prime the circuit so that the total blood volume will not be, the extracorporeal volume will not be more than 10% of the blood volume. If that happens, the child will be in shock, child will arrest. So that is very important.
Now, your children, you have shown, are they attending school or not attending school? Because schooling is a very important aspect of the child's overall growth.
Actually, there are a whole lot of, we are having some 20 children on dialysis right now, and children who are right now the COVID time. So all of them are attending the online classes. Otherwise, we are actually giving them days so that those who are in higher classes, we give one day Saturday dialysis so that they can go to school, and then 1 or 2 days in the afternoon. So we try to adjust so that they can attend the school. And some of my kids, or most of my kids who are after transplantation, they have gone back to their studies, and they are doing this 10th and 12th private exams. They are all doing well. They are all doing well. They are all rehabilitated to their
one last question to both all three nephrologists. When you do a transplant in these children, you are putting an adult kidney into a child. And we all know that there are technical issues and other issues with that. Because one of my students who was trained with Professor late Oscar Salvaterra, he was priming down the kidney, or he was downsizing the kidney before he transplants to children. What is your opinion, all three nephrologists, of doing when you put a large adult kidney into a child?
So actually, Harpana will say first.
No, after you, Susan, you started. Continue.
No, you can say.
So
Arpana.
we have experienced large kidneys going into smaller kids, and we have faced technical problems that have led to delayed graft function because of space issues. So sometimes the abdomen wall could not be closed, and it had to be left open till they could be closed post-op after a couple of days. There are problems with the placing the kidney in the bed. Sometimes the vessels get kinked as soon as the kidney is placed on the bed, and once the kidney is just lifted up again, it becomes pink and firm. So that is one issue. The other issue with an adult kidney getting into a small kid would be when there is unclamping and more hypotension intra-op, and hypertension, how to approach the hypertension post-op. Because we have to keep in mind that we are dealing with an adult kidney, and approaching the BP recordings post-op is also important. So definitely there are challenges of a big kidney getting into a smaller child.
Thank you. It was a great opportunity for me to interact with you. I learned a lot from Susan and also from Arpana. And Kalaivani, thank you for giving me this great opportunity. And I thank Professor Nammalwar also for this. And
Sir, sorry to interrupt. We have few more questions in the question box.
Is it? Where is it? I can't see the question box. I don't have.
Like, I know we are exceeding time, but we still have few more questions in the question box. Can I read it out, sir? Is that fine with you?
Yeah,
please
here
read
it is. Yeah, a child.
The question is for Dr. Susan. Child presents with pulmonary edema. How do we prescribe ultrafiltration? What maximum it can be removed?
Yeah, child is in pulmonary edema and you're already having the access in situ, then you can start off with the dialysis. And as I have shown the Guyton curve, you have to understand that the pulmonary edema will become better as you remove not the full amount of fluid need not be removed. So the ultrafiltration is to be tailored in such a way that 8% of the removal will be happening in the first hour, and then the subsequent hours 4% is happening. So you will see that once you start the dialysis, you take the extracorporeal volume, the field that will start improving the child, because you have reduced the blood volume or this effective arterial blood volume that is too much in this child. It's taken out. That itself is going to improve the symptoms a bit, and then you can actually remove 8%. You can even do an isolated ultrafiltration initially in the first hour, remove the fluid. 8% of the total UF has to be removed in the first hour.
Okay, thank you, madam. Next question is to Dr. Arpana. Do you check uric acid levels in kids with CKD and address high levels with diet or medications?
High uric acid levels is not recommended to be checked in every patient unless you're suspecting native kidney disease that is related to high uric acid levels. But otherwise, routinely, uric acid is not something that we would look for in every child with CKD, unlike in adults.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Next question is to Dr. Arpana. DASH diet has got high potassium. Is it still advised in CKD children?
Exactly. So DASH diet has got recommendations of moderate to severe restriction of salt, but at the same time is rich in fruits and vegetables and a Mediterranean kind of diet, which is going to be high in potassium. So obviously we will not recommend DASH diet to a child who has a tendency to have hyperkalemia, but could be used in children who have tubular disorders where they are anyway thirsty, they crave for salt, and they also lose potassium and other elements in the urine in these tubular disorders. So in such children, this can be used. However, DASH diet is not something very easy to implement because it takes probably even generations, forget about years, but generations to adapt oneself to restricted salt. And that is what is recommended by the DASH diet in terms of the challenges of, severely restricting the salt. So though I have mentioned DASH, and DASH diet is something that is recommended. It's not something that is very easy to implement in children in terms of restricting the salt. Of course, potassium will be high, and it can be used in children who have hypokalemia.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Next question is to Dr. Susan. I would like to know about the indications to prescribe more than 3 times a week dialysis.
Indications for more than 3 times dialysis, like a child who has come in pulmonary edema. And so the child is severely hypertensive and fluid overloaded. Such a child, you have to dialyze. See, if you dialyze him 3 times weekly and take lot of ultrafiltration, he is not going to tolerate the dialysis. He may develop the crashing, and he may even have a cardiac event that is happening during dialysis. Such a patient. So what I have seen is control of blood pressure is the most important factor that will sometimes tell you to give more frequent dialysis. Also, if a child is under-dialyzed, child is not able to eat well, persistent vomiting, looking at the child, not able to eat, lot of edema is there, severe hypertension is there, you know that obvious signs of underdialysis is there. In such cases, we can give more frequent dialysis for maybe 1 week or so, reassess again, and then you can actually come down if you feel that you are reaching the proper dry weight is reached and child is metabolically more stable.
Okay, so we are done with the questions, ma'am. Georgie, sir, you can give the closing remark and we can close the session.
Thank you, Kalivani, and it was a great session. And I enjoyed it. I learned it. I'm sure that many others who were listening to it also. So there is in the question thing, there is a request whether the slides can be shared. I saw that just now. So it's up to the speakers to decide on that. And thank you, Arpana, and thank you, Susan and Kalivani and the colleagues for arranging this IPNA Congress, especially in an evening, and because so many people can attend. So good night and thank you so much. And we look forward to many more such interactions in future. Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you, Kalivani, for being such a wonderful host. All hard work of yours has made this successful.
Thank you.
I also would like to thank Kalivani and the entire team. Actually,
yes, thank you,
supported so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Bye-bye, sir.